Hi, this is David Unsworth, English editor of the PanAm Post. This is the first edition of the PanAm Post's English podcast. I'm here with Daniel Raisbeck, editor-in-chief of the PanAm Post, to talk about the impact of Trump's presidency on U.S.-Latin American relations. So just last week, Obama announced the repeal of the long-standing wet foot, dry foot policy for Cuban migrants that was implemented by President Clinton in 1994. What do you think Trump is going to do with regard to that policy?
Well, David, that's a good point and quite important actually for Latin America. I read a few days ago, I think it came out in the Miami Herald, that Trump said that he wasn't necessarily going to repeal that policy. The way I see it, that was more or less a trap set by Obama and the Democrats for Trump in electoral terms, because since he gave this anti-immigration or anti-illegal immigration speech during the whole campaign, then they wanted to put him really in a position where if he repealed Obama's measure, then they could hammer him in the midterm elections or in the next presidential election, saying that he didn't keep his promise to end illegal immigration, and saying that he was making a special concession for Cubans, or at least that's how I see it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and obviously the Cuban community typically votes very differently than the Latino community at large, which is somewhere around almost 20% of the United States population. What do you think about Trump has issued some pretty conflicting statements recently. During the campaign, for example, he took a very hard line on his immigration policies. Now he's saying that he's not going to overturn Obama's DREAM Act, which protects people under 18 who are in the United States illegally. And he's also saying that he has no plans for any mass deportations of the estimated 20 million people that are in the United States illegally.
Right, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I noticed during the campaign, he was speaking of deportations, especially for illegal immigrants with criminal records. And I mean, I think his supporters would feel betrayed if he didn't take some kind of action in that respect.
Yeah, he's frequently mentioned the figure of 3 million illegal immigrants with criminal records that he is planning on deporting. But do you think that his supporters will feel betrayed if he doesn't step up the deportations even further?
Oh, well, it depends on whom exactly you ask, and I mean, I think it's a difficult phenomenon to explain, because naturally, I also think Trumpism in the end is a coalition of different groups. And I think in terms of immigration, some are definitely more hardline than others. I think for many people, just the fact that he was willing to talk about immigration in the terms that he did, and first of all recognize that for many people it is a problem, helped him out electorally. And now the politics of that and the implementation of that is a whole different deal.
Now, one of the pillars of Trump's policy with regard to immigration in Latin America has been his promise to construct a wall along the United States southern border, which is largely the Rio Grande River. I've seen some conflicting figures about the cost. Obviously, the Republicans who support it are going to be giving a lower figure. I've seen anywhere from $10 billion to Democrats claiming it's going to be, 30 or even $40 billion. Do you see an appropriation going through Congress for such a wall? And do you see that happening in Obama's first term? I'm sorry, in Trump's first term?
Well, again, it's one of those things that he promised during the campaign. So I think he's forced to build something, even if it's just symbolic and has absolutely no effect on immigration. So I mean, I think it's difficult to tell. I think the wiser heads among the punditry right now are the ones saying it's really very difficult to know, or also impossible to predict exactly what Trump will do, because one thing is what he said during the campaign. Another thing is what he actually can do during his presidency. An interesting part of that problem, or that issue as I see it, was his insistence that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. And the Mexican government has gone out of its way on numerous occasions to say they're definitely not going to pay for the wall. But we had an article in the PanAm Post this week or last week discussing how through indirect ways Trump could force Mexico actually to pay for the wall.
Taxing visas for Mexican nationals, taxing or confiscating remittance payments from Mexican citizens living in the United States that are sent back to Mexico.
Exactly.
Do you think that's going to happen?
And the interesting thing is that Trump said during the campaign, Mexico is going to pay for the wall. He didn't say exactly who in Mexico was going to pay for the wall, as far as I know. Or he didn't say exactly how he was going to charge them for the wall. But in terms of immigration, I think there's something very important here, which is the coverage in the Latin American press. Because I'm looking right now at the main site of El Espectador, which is Colombia's second biggest daily newspaper. And they have an article about, center left, quite left, progressive. And their headline is, how to resist and survive Donald Trump. So pretty much all of the Latin American mainstream media, since they take their views on US politics from the US mainstream media, especially the Washington Post and the New York Times, whom they not so humbly consider their equals. So the coverage that you get in Latin America is filtered through these anti-Trump, very anti-Trump outlets. Now, what I think is interesting in that respect is that they never talk about how anti-immigrant Latin American countries' immigration policy actually is. So you have the example of Colombia, where you have this exodus of people coming from Venezuela, escaping communism, escaping the Chavez-Maduro regime, and it's very difficult for them to actually come to live and work in Colombia. You have Cuban refugees trying to escape the Castro regime coming through Colombia because they fly to Ecuador, which is the only country that doesn't require a visa for Cubans. As they make their way up to the United States north, the Colombian government has been very repressive. And if you even go back in history...
The Nicaraguan government as well.
Right. I just use Colombia as an example, but Nicaragua has sent... Sure. Daniel Ortega, president of Nicaragua, maybe dictator would be a better term, has sent the army out against Cuban immigrants coming into the country. So really, Mexico has deported more Central Americans in the last few years than the United States has deported Mexicans. So really...
And on that note, it's also interesting to observe that there has actually been discussion in Mexico of building a border wall to prevent Guatemalan, Honduran, and Salvadorian immigration northbound towards the United States.
Right, and the interesting thing is that the Latin American press barely ever mentions that. And they don't scrutinize their own governments in terms of immigration. And if they're so pro-immigration, why aren't they putting their own governments against the wall and saying, okay, let's have open borders? But they do implicitly or explicitly require the United States to have open borders and basically let anyone in who just wants to go there. And so I think this is one example of a huge hypocrisy.
There's a slight bit of hypocrisy there.
Right. And that's only one example in terms of the Latin American press and its coverage of the Trump presidency, but it obviously goes back to the campaign itself.
Now, another issue that's very important to Latin Americans with in the wake of Trump's inauguration is the various free trade agreements. Colombia has one, CAFTA, there's a Central American free trade agreement, and of course, the giant in the room is NAFTA. Trump has promised to renegotiate, although he, as with Trump, as we've discussed, he often seems to vacillate a bit. He kind of takes a hard line and then he pulls back a bit, kind of gauges public reaction. Where do you see the future of renegotiation of NAFTA?
Right, well, as you mentioned, Trump's style is based upon making some very bold and extreme claims in order to have a very strong negotiating position. And once he negotiates, apparently he does yield. So then again, it's very difficult to say what exactly is going to happen with NAFTA or what a renegotiation would look like. However, from a libertarian perspective, I would say that this is very harmful, not only for the Mexican economy, but also for the Latin American economy, but in the end, it will also be harmful for the US economy because if people have to pay more for cars because they're produced in the US vehicles, then people will have not as much money in their pocket. On the other hand,
there's pretty clear statistical evidence to demonstrate that I believe it was 94, 95 that Clinton pushed through NAFTA. But the past 20 years, the statistics clearly demonstrate that NAFTA was a phenomenal success for Canadians, for Mexicans, and for Americans. So what the problem with Trump's candidacy and with his campaign was that, what won him the election? Well, it was the Rust Belt. It was Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. These are the places that were really devastated by NAFTA. But the fact of the matter is, I think as Americans, we need to have a discussion about, well, if things aren't working, if the economy that was there in the Rust Belt in the 70s and 80s is not working now in 2017, well, we need to reassess whether it makes sense for us to be doing these things, this type of manufacturing in the United States.
Right. Well, I think the other side of the coin, and which is not discussed enough, I think, is that, yes, Trump has these protectionist policies and certainly a protectionist rhetoric, but his tax policy appears to be very libertarian. He wants to really cut taxes across the board, cut corporate taxes, and even the World Bank has said that this might save the world economy in the coming years. So you also have to question whether the decline of American industry also has to do with an increasingly punitive tax system for heavy industry. And Trump's policy might be able to somehow reverse that. Then again, his protectionist instincts might also do tremendous harm to the American economy and to the world economy, for that matter.
It'll be very interesting to see. And the Republican Party traditionally has been a bastion of free trade and a bastion of classical liberalism.
Well, at least in rhetoric, right?
But recent polls have shown that people who identify as Republicans in the United States, there has been a huge backlash against free trade agreements when you take polls and surveys and so forth. We could be seeing a very interesting sea change with regard to the free trade issue, which has traditionally been, and you also have to remember, it's typically been Democratic presidents that have supported free trade, but Congress has not. I mean, the representatives and senators in Congress have been very much against free trade. So it could be an issue that could really divide the Republican Party in the coming 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when you think of truly libertarian, classical liberal senators like Rand Paul. But in that sense, I think that's something very interesting about Trump's election and the way he campaigned was that he completely flipped the conventional wisdom on its head, because it was usually thought, as you well know, that Republicans are in favor of free trade and they're also in favor of small c conservative policies, for instance, against political correctness and against the states limiting free speech and really getting in people's lives excessively. Now, Trump, he kept the second part of that conventional wisdom, and he used it very effectively in his favor, for instance, with his frontal assault against political correctness. But on the trade side, he went more democratic, even to a certain degree, in a Bernie Sanders direction. So I think Trump truly represents something that we haven't seen before, at least in the recent past, and you would have to go to past U.S. populist presidents, perhaps even as far back as the 19th century, to see a similar phenomenon.
Sure. Now, to turn the discussion back to Cuba, we have a very interesting situation because in the past 2 years, the Obama administration has really forcefully pushed through a thaw in U.S.-Cuba relations that began with opening of embassies in Washington and Havana, normalization of trade relations and economic relations, and a huge boom in tourism. Before, just Cuban citizens were allowed to go to visit their families or people doing humanitarian or religious work. What is Trump going to do with regard to tourism, with regard to our diplomatic relations, with regard to our trade relations?
Right. Well, again, I think it's very difficult to predict, but Trump very intelligently, I think, he did notice that the Cuban American community in South Florida, especially, wasn't very pleased with Obama's handling of the Cuba situation. Because even if you, like me, think that the embargo was in large part a mistake, because it allowed the Castro regime to have an excuse for all its failures, which is a bit contradictory, because they blame U.S. imperialism for all the world's evils, but then they blame the lack of trade with the U.S. for their own failure. So in that sense, I think even if you agree that the embargo wasn't the best idea, once it's in place, I think you have to say, fine, you can get rid of it, but the Cuban government really should yield on, for instance, democracy, open up democracy in Cuba. The Castro regime, Castro brothers did completely the opposite. In fact, repression has increased in the last 2 years. And I think that really upset people in South Florida. And Trump took a very strong line, saying that he was with the Cuban people and against Castro. When Fidel Castro died, Trump was practically the only world leader who called things as they were and basically called him a dictator. So then again, I think the people who voted for him or who support him in South Florida, especially the Cuban community, will expect a harder line from Trump. And I think
Trump has said that we gave away too much. Trump has said, well, okay, Obama gave Cuba A, B, and C, but he did not demand much in return.
Right. Right.
And Raul Castro's crackdown on dissidents has been rather brutal during this time period. He does make a big show every couple of months of releasing political prisoners, and then he seems to arrest them again when it suits him. Case in point, something we've written about in the PanAm Post is the Cuban dissident artist El Sexto, who for what are clearly political offenses, not criminal offenses, is in one of Cuba's most maximum security prisons. So
right, and it's and in that sense, it's very similar to what the Venezuelan regime does. Sometimes they spontaneously or not so spontaneously release, let's say, 5 political prisoners, but the same day they put another 10 political prisoners in prison, in jail. So that's their method, and I think personally that Trump is absolutely right in this issue. One thing is to end the embargo, to have business with Cuba. I think Trump, as a hard-nosed businessman, really understands the value of that. But I do think that he's correct when he says that the Obama administration really gave the Cubans too much, the Cuban regime too much, without asking basically for anything in return.
Now, as we know, Cuba was dependent for such a long period of time on the Soviet Union, who bought their sugar at prices far above world market prices. Then they were quite dependent upon Venezuela, which conveniently elected Chavez in '98. Now Venezuela is in crisis, and Russia is obviously not in any position to help them anymore. What is Cuba going to be doing with regard to tourism? And is Trump going to say, yes, all Americans who want to go and pour dollars into Cuba's economy, we are going to allow that to happen?
Right.
I think that's one of the
exactly
most interesting.
It's a very good question, and I think another element that is very important, and it may have been Obama's motivation to give so much to the Castro regime, is that they want to avoid another Mariel boat lift.
Absolutely.
In which you have tens of thousands or maybe more Cubans you have a refugee crisis in South Florida, and you don't really have the means to deal with it. And I think that's what the Obama administration was trying to avoid.
That is actually the historical basis for the American classic film Scarface.
Right, it begins with, I think Al Pacino arrives in Miami or somewhere in South Florida as part of the Mariel boat lift.
Yes.
Right. So
yes, absolutely.
So and that's what they and I mean maybe people my age don't remember this very well, but this was really a humanitarian crisis in Florida, South Florida.
It was actually. I read Bill Clinton's autobiography, My Life, a couple of years ago, and when he was governor of Arkansas, it was Jimmy Carter at this point. It was a huge domestic crisis for the United States because we could not handle this influx of refugees. It's also interesting to note that exactly what so many Cubans feared Obama would do, he did do in the last week of his presidency. You know, we kept reading in the press about waves of Cuban migrants flying to Ecuador, which, as you said, doesn't require a visa, or getting to Mexico and crossing the border there. It has happened. It has happened, and now Trump has a very, very big decision on his hands.
Right, because that's where two pillars, one stronger than the other, of Trump's candidacy really come into conflict. Because one pillar is against illegal immigration, and the other pillar is against these oppressive regimes. Because he spoke out against Cuba, against Venezuela, against the Venezuelan government or dictatorship. So I think he has a very fine line to thread.
Now, with regard to Donald Trump, obviously talks quite a bit about Mexico and Cuba and illegal immigration in his campaign. He didn't really talk much about the phenomenon that in the past decade has often been termed the pink tide. Now, obviously, many of those leaders are now out of power. The Workers' Party in Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. Cristina Kirchner's successor, Daniel Scioli, just lost an election to Mauricio Macri. But there are several of these leaders still in power: Evo Morales, Daniel Ortega, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. How is Trump going to deal with, say, left-leaning, socialist-leaning leaders in Latin America? Or, of course, the giant in the room, Venezuela.
Right, well, exactly. I think possibly aside from Venezuela, it might not even be on his agenda. Because in the end, I think that both the Bush and the Obama administrations in that sense got things right by not interfering excessively and just letting these regimes, I mean, all of these regimes were voted out of power. Even we had that in Bogota at the local level, where we had 12 years of government by the left, and people were so fed up.
Petro, and
right, Petro, Moreno, and Garzón, and people were so fed up of bad government that they voted for pretty much the extreme opposite in 2015. So in that sense, I think time more or less is running out for these hard left regimes, especially because the poster boy is Venezuela, and nobody else in Latin America wants to be Venezuela for obvious reasons. I even sense that in social media you have these progressives and socialists saying, "Oh well, you know, Venezuela is not really socialist. It's not really what we had in mind. Our new poster boy is maybe Rafael Correa or Evo Morales in Bolivia. Those are the goodies, and whereas Maduro and Chavez are now the baddies." So, but even in Bolivia, Evo Morales lost the referendum so that he was trying to stay in power pretty much indefinitely.
And now he's trying to host or to hold another referendum, although numerous civil society groups, in particular the Bolivian Catholic Church, have come out against his plan, saying, "You lost the referendum. It
Exactly.
Well, right
it's very typical. It's more or less what they did in Colombia, where the Santos government lost the referendum last year, and so the people didn't approve his deal with the FARC guerrillas, but they rammed it through Congress anyway. So in a more civilized country like Great Britain, for instance, David Cameron resigned the day after he lost the Brexit referendum. So that doesn't tend to happen in Latin America. The presidents don't usually resign. But I think in this sense, it was very important that Bolivians did reject the Evo Morales project by rejecting his permanence in power. Now he might, somehow reform the constitution or find a way to stay, but I think it's very important that he knows that there's resistance, which doesn't always happen. For instance, in Nicaragua.
Now, Trump, there was one thing we've discussed quite frequently is that the massive backlash by the Latino community against Donald Trump never materialized.
Right.
According to CNN's exit polls, he got 29% of the vote. It would appear, if you do some research, he actually got even a higher percentage. How will Trump's relation with the Latino community, which makes up about 20% of the United States, how will it be, and what can he do to improve his outreach to the Latino community in the United States?
Right. Well, you wrote a very good article about how that Latino backlash against Trump, which was, taken for granted in all of the media. I remember it didn't happen. I remember this lady, Ana Navarro, if I'm not mistaken, is her name. The night of the election, she was saying that, speaking in Spanish, she was saying that her people were going to put Hillary Clinton in the White House. So,
oops.
Right. So, I think that it's difficult to say again, but I think a lot of, as in the case of Ronald Reagan, his success among the American public in general will depend on the economy. So I think that if you start having real economic growth under Trump, not this anemic growth that you've had under Obama, and then again, it all depends on whether his protectionist policies don't really hurt America and whether his tax cuts are sufficiently extreme to unleash America's creative potential. And I think that will, if he runs for a re-election, that could even improve his standing among Latino voters.
And another thing that political commentators perhaps overlooked is that there's a big difference between the first generation Latino community and the Latino community that has been here for 2 or 3 or 4. There are Latinos that have been in the United States for over 100 years. So it's very, very difficult. It's not a monolithic community. It's not a monolithic demographic group.
Right.
Not racially, not religiously, not geographically, not politically. So, and also I get the sense that the Latinos that took to social media and took to the streets to protest, typically millennials, the 18 to 35 demographic, far more likely to be affiliated with the Democratic Party, to the left end of the Democratic Party, and very anti-Trump. So one of the things I thought was the most interesting about Trump's campaign, you saw at his rallies these signs: the silent majority stands with Trump. Now, that was a slogan used by Nixon. It's very rare in American politics that anyone harkens back to Nixon. But if you had to come up with one reason, point to one reason why Trump was predicted to lose in a landslide and he ended up winning the Electoral College with more than 300 votes, it would be because of that. The silent majority stands with Trump. So obviously Trump did not get a majority of Latino votes, but he probably got a good solid third of Latino votes, which was something that no one ever thought was going to happen.
Right, and there's something very interesting which you mentioned, which is that there's the generational issue, where a second generation Latino person or a person with Latin American parents might feel much more American than Latin American, and will vote not as a Hispanic but as an American citizen, and the concerns might include security or lack thereof, and economic growth, and so forth.
And it's very possible that the small but very real percentage of illegal immigrants that have been committing crimes are they're likely not doing it, say, in wealthy, predominantly white suburban neighborhoods. They're likely doing it in inner city environments where probably a lot of Latinos live. So it's very possible that, you know, this concept of identity politics, because you're white or Latino or black or gay or Catholic or Jewish or whatever, you're all going to think and vote a certain way. Perhaps Trump's election has really called the whole concept of identity politics into question.
Right. The other thing I was going to mention, and that you mentioned as well, is that it's not a uniform bloc, the Hispanic vote. It's not the same to be a recently arrived Cuban in Miami, for instance, as to be a Puerto Rican in Orlando. Starting with the fact that you're a U.S. citizen, if you're a Puerto Rican, you might not even speak Spanish, or a Mexican immigrant in Texas or California, especially if you have really third generation Mexicans who, again, might identify more with being Texan than with being Mexican, just to give an example.
Sure.
Where I do think, what I do think, and I read this, I believe in The Spectator yesterday, was that curiously this whole identity voting speech and idea, which was that you would have all these basically the same groups that went out in mass to vote for maybe Barack Obama, maybe a lot of Latinos, but also blacks and women, for instance, were going to vote for Hillary Clinton for the same reasons. Whereas what you did see was maybe the formation of identity politics within the white American community, for all the reasons that they didn't expect, because since they've been telling white Americans for so long that they're basically oppressors and imperialists, and basically mocking their basic culture, especially working class Americans, well, maybe they did manage to create a bloc of identity voters, but not among minorities, but rather in the majority.
Right, and even, I mean, the statistic, the most shocking statistic to me was that Trump won a third of Latino votes. The second most shocking statistic was that Trump won white women 52% to 42%. And when you're talking about non-college educated women, it was even higher than that. I mean, he probably won around 60% or 65% of non-college educated white women. So he broke the political mold. There's no doubt about that. One thing I briefly wanted to ask you about as well was here in Colombia, obviously the issue that has been dominating our political discourse for 2 years is the peace agreement between President Santos and the FARC. What do you expect Trump to do with regard to that? Or is it really even on Trump's radar screen?
Right. It's one of those things, it's very difficult to tell, because at the beginning I would have thought, just Trump being Trump, he was going to be very skeptical of all this nonsense about there being peace in Colombia suddenly because they signed a piece of paper. And if Trump thought that U.S. negotiators of trade agreements with other countries were bad, imagine what he would have thought of Colombia's negotiators with the FARC, who really surrendered everything with no reason really to do so. So I would have thought at the beginning, I thought that he was going to be very, if it was even on his radar, he was going to be very critical of it. On the other hand, it turns out that Rudy Giuliani, who is very close to Trump, and he was even mentioned as a possible cabinet pick, he has been advising the Santos government for several years on the peace agreement, of course getting paid a handsome fee, I'm sure. So,
of course.
so it's difficult to tell really. But there's no doubt that the Santos government preferred a continuation of Obama's policies, just completely supporting that agreement without really having any notion of what's going on in Colombia, and that would have happened under Hillary Clinton. So they were. Right. I think it took them completely by surprise that Trump won, and I wonder to what degree they've rethought their original strategy.
Right. I mean, as with most Latin American leaders, I mean, take even a center-right or right-wing leader like Mauricio Macri in Argentina. He publicly came out and supported Hillary Clinton, or said that publicly his preference would be for Hillary Clinton. And, of course, on the night of November 8th, when everyone had the shock of a lifetime, he quickly backtracked from that and said that, well, you know what? Even though Donald Trump is president, Argentina and the United States are going to have the greatest relationship in history, in our bilateral history.
Right, and you have that across the world, because even Boris Johnson, Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, at some point during the campaign, he did say some terrible things about Donald Trump, criticizing for his comments, I think, on Muslims. And now it turns out that he's very pro-Trump, or at least very pro-US-UK trade agreement, which would be very important for the UK post-Brexit. So I guess the lesson is that really politicians of all stripes should watch their words when commenting on elections in other countries.
Now, we were talking a bit before about the pink tide and the degree to which the United States has been geopolitically or militarily or economically involved in the region. Trump has seemed to take a tact with his foreign policy that he is less inclined to intervention than, say, the neoconservative tradition of Bush, that to a reasonable degree was also continued during 8 years of the Obama presidency. What do you think Trump will do geopolitically in the region?
In what region specifically are you?
Well, particularly if we look at something like, say, the way that Latin America is under the influence of Russia, is under the influence of China. For example, China has been trying to build a canal to compete with, obviously, the American-backed Panama Canal. China's been trying to build a canal through Nicaragua.
Which apparently is far more difficult than they claimed.
Periodically engaged in joint military exercises with Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela. What do you see Trump doing with regard to these developments?
Well, I don't think, I haven't sensed any yearning from Trump to return to a manifest destiny type of policy in the hemisphere. So,
or the Platt Amendment in Cuba.
Right. So, I mean, it's difficult to tell. But again, in terms of global politics, I don't think Latin America is at the top of his agenda. I mean, I think obviously relations with Russia, situation in Eastern Europe, Syria. The region around Syria is far more important in geostrategic terms, at least at the moment. Maybe Mexico is at the top of his agenda. Mexico, perhaps Central America, due to immigration. But in terms
one thing that has really been affecting Mexico in the past 2 months since Donald Trump's election is the complete free fall of the Mexican peso. Every week we seem to get a new report that it's hit new lows. Obviously, that is great for for Mexican exporters. We've had a very, very strong dollar in the past couple of years, particularly in regard to Latin American currencies, which have all slumped. How do you see that developing during the Trump presidency?
Right. Well, I think that's just a reaction to the markets and the fall in the Mexican peso. The Mexican government, the Mexican central bank, they've tried to implement measures to at least halt that process as much as they can. But I think this is one of the negative consequences of a Trump presidency, where you have this really mercantilist policy of Trump telling companies that, or really threatening companies that if they build cars, for instance, in Mexico, they're going to face a huge tariff trying to import them into the US. And really, you have Trump picking winners and losers in the economy. And from a libertarian perspective, this is obviously awful. So on the other hand, I think the comparison that I can make is with the Colombia-Venezuela relationship, trade relationship, because Venezuela was traditionally Colombia's main trading partner. And with Chavez and border closures, obviously from their side, really Colombia had to think again about, and Colombian producers, also the government, about how to boost exports to other markets. And I think a result of that was the creation of the Pacific Alliance with Mexico and Chile and Peru. And now you have other countries wanting to join. So sometimes when you have these protectionist, mercantilist policies, it ends up having a positive effect in the long term, because countries and businesses have to stop being so lazy and start thinking of ways to innovate and to reach other markets. So what in the short term might be very negative for Mexico might in the long term end up being an opportunity, for instance, to strengthen its ties to other Latin American countries and Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world.